Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Swati Biswas from the Department of Islamic History and Culture, University of Calcutta. We are going to discuss today the module, the Western Indian Painting School. The objective of this module is to learn about the evolution of the Western Indian Painting School, the features of this school, the development of the school from 14th to 15th century and up to 16th, the areas where this school evolved and how it developed, and the reason for the continuity of this school till date. In the introduction, we have to say that the Western Indian School of Painting initially was known as the Jain School of Painting, as this was started in the Bhandaras of the Jain. Later, this genre was practiced in eastern and central part of India. Western Indian art as a term does not only cater to the Jaina miniatures but also encompasses the style that was prevalent in North from 13th century, and it went up to the date today, and it was much in the formative stages of the Mughals. It was a group of painters who flocked to the Mughal atelier and adopted themselves to the Mughal painting culture in a large number. Let's talk about the initial phase of the 15th century. We have to understand that the earliest format of this school is not known because it has not survived the time. The school started by painting on palm leaf, but that phase ended with the introduction of paper. Manuscripts that have been available till date suggest that the first half of 15th century was the formative period of the school as we see it today. From 14th century, the monotony, it progressed fast to improve the quality of drawing and colors. Patan, Ahmedabad, Gandhar, Vadnagar, Champaner were the important areas of Gujarat, and then this school moved on to central India and then to move to the east when it formed a genre of painting. Based on strict iconography, it was started by the monks in the Bhandaras, as we have discussed earlier, to preserve the religious tenets of Jainism. It moved from palm leaf illustration to paper illustration in the 13th century, giving more scope to the artist to experiment. The pothi format or the horizontal format remained throughout the 15th and the 16th century, and it also continued later. It conformed to the one whole two column pattern with margins in red and red roundel markings the whole. Now, this was purposely done in the palm leaf manuscripts, but this format continued as it became a part of the iconography. The iconography of the Jainas gave it little scope to experiment with the narrative tradition of illustrations initially. The 14th century illustrations were though high quality, but from 1400 onward distinctly, there was an increasing tendency towards rigidity and distortion. The protrusion of chest, bust and hips along the exaggeration of the further eye became the marker of this artistic style and continued throughout the 15th and the early 16th century. The 15th century, the progressive Jaina and the Hindu miniatures tried to keep the figures in strict profile, and it was one of the iconographic features of this school. The paper miniatures abandoned the habit of color modeling, and the outlines were now in flat planes of color in brittle line. Costly colors were used along with gold and silver. As the patrons increased their interest in the manuscript's production, the importance of colors also increased. Apart from the change in profile and color, there were other changes which made significant transformation in the illustration of Western Indian painting style in the 15th and the 16th century. The rigidity in the 15th and the 16th century diminished in some of the high quality manuscripts where we can say that there was some kind of supervision on the part of the premier artists. The linear format was still used, but changes soon progressed in the areas of Gujarat, and then it became popular in central India along with areas like Mandu and Jaunpur. The non-Jaina professional artists initiated such moves sometimes unknowingly. The Persian motif soon became popular. We have to understand that this was a time when the Persian painting was flooded in the markets of India. The style of Persian painting came in the form of books, in the carpet, in the other forms of art, and the artists soon grabbed the style. The Jaina miniatures' progress was very slow but holistic. The artists took some liberty to introduce what they saw in the market, but that progress, we have to understand, was within the iconographic limitations of the school. There were few exceptions, of course, which definitely speak loads about this school's change. The 15th century Jaina miniature school is also a time, we can say, when the school matured. It incorporated many changes that we see kept on developing. The 15th century significant was the importance of the Indian painting style was highly influenced by the Persian elements, as we have seen. In spite of the hieratic rigidity, it struggled to reach that natural form in the hands of the painters. The pictorial effect was enhanced by the judicious use of colors and metallic effects of gold and mica. This was definitely an influence of Persian painting. The tendency was to higher essential Persian style within the iconographic norms. With time, it also became a marker of the Jaina expressions, as it is evident from the Shahi figures of Kalakacharya Gatha. Interestingly, the Shahi kings always remained in three-quarter profile, unlike the other figures of the school, so that the foreign elements within the painting school could be kept in one marked form. The draftsmanship detail and the use of ultramarine and gold became important to this genre of painting style. Distortion of the later period was absent, with the protruding eyes remained just as a mark of the tradition. So therefore, when the artist also learned to remain within the profile, the protrusion of the eyes was an iconographic feature from which the artist did not want to move, or perhaps the patron did not like the artist to move. The human figure was marked by fine draftsmanship. Exaggeration of the body parts was also avoided in some of the fine quality manuscripts of the time. The female figures were artistically drawn, and it could avoid certain cliches of iconography. We also have to understand that detailing of the clothes and the ornaments also appeared in some of the manuscripts, which became one of the markers of this genre. The role of the patrons in certain manuscripts is very important. We have to understand that the Jaina merchants, especially the ones who operated in the borders of Gujarat and in certain urban areas of Mandu and Jaunpur, had this habit of donating illustrated manuscript to the Bhandaras as their religious token. They were immensely interested in the painting format. The best example of this may be the 1475 Devasana Pado Kalpasutra of Gandhara near Broch. The patterns drawn from the architecture, textile and carpet also show about the economic prosperity of the time and how the elements of art influence from one genre to the other. Now, apart from that, we also can discuss some of the non-Jaina manuscripts which had immense importance during this time. This was definitely a significant change in the art form. The illustrator understood that how landscape had to be incorporated along with the social life. Now, this was again a direct influence of the Persian school of painting. Now, the format of the Western Indian school gave very little scope, but the space that they had was used distinctly by the movement of the landscapes, which, like their Persian counterparts, had little space to share. These trends were seen in the Vaishnava paintings like the Bal Gopal Stuti and the Gita Govinda, and they further enhanced by improving the emotional understanding and added certain movement. The earliest document, of course, of this is the secular scroll painting of Vasanta Vilasa of 1451. Now, this Vasanta Vilasa is a very important document because this is one of the only perhaps dated secular or non-Jaina manuscript. Now, we can understand that by 1451, the genre had reached a stage where they could now produce certain romantic lores like Vasanta Vilasa, which incorporated perhaps all the stylistic features of the time, including certain amount of movement and expression of the animals and the human characters. Now, this manuscript culture, of course, moved beyond Gujarat. This aspect moved the boundaries of Gujarat and reached the states of Malwa and Rajasthan, and it also reached certain parts of Jaunpur, as we see from the Kalpasutras of 1465. The story of Western Indian painting will remain incomplete without the analysis of the two brilliant pieces of Jaina manuscripts from Mandu. Jainism flourished during this period and the period before that, during the time of the Paramars in Mandu. Interestingly, the pictorial art of Malwa is few. After the frescoes of Bagh in the 5th century, the important painting interest was then in these Jaina manuscripts. There is a huge gap in between. The first Kalpasutra was published by Sarabhai Nawab. The manuscript is now in the collection of Sri Kanti Vijayji, deposited in the Atmanand Jnana Bhandara of Baroda. The ultramarine was used in substantial amount and the draftsmanship of this manuscript is of high quality. The second, of course, is presented to the National Museum by Acharya Vijendra Suri. This manuscript was perhaps prepared in 1439 by Khemarangini as per its colophon during the time of Mahmud Shah Khalji, was of great importance for the understanding of the evolving painting style of 15th century. The influence of Persian painting style and the contemporary painting schools of India. The Jaina school did not deviate from its root, but perhaps due to the availability of Persian paintings, its market, especially the Turkoman style of Shiraz, influenced the artist greatly. The artists matured themselves to the height of excellence in the coming years and was later able to grasp the activities of the Mughal school. So therefore, we have to understand the 15th-16th century manuscript style, of course, produced certain amount of artists, very important group of trained artists who moved later in the mid-16th century to the courts of Akbar or to the atelier of Akbar and moved into the new Mughal school. The Jaunpur Kalpasutra of 1465, which is now in the Baroda in the Narasimhaji Pol Gyan Bhandar, and the Devasanaparo Kalpasutra of 1475 also has certain similarities with the Kalpasutra in the National Museum. The Kalpasutra in the collection of Muni Kanti Vijayaji in the Atmanand Gyan Bhandar of Baroda was also painted in Mantu. The colophon, of course, is incomplete. Stylistically, this manuscript belonged to the 15th century. The refinement here is also mention-worthy. The composition is elaborate. The Persian influence is limited to only the use of ultramarine, carmine, and gold. The floral spray also has Persian lineages. Now let's move to the importance of Vasanta Vilasa. Vasanta Vilasa at the Freer Gallery of 1415 gave a new direction to the Indian painting. It is an old love poem of Gujarat. The subject itself gave scope to treat the human figures with new life in the backdrop of a different landscape far removed from the Jaina heretic of the time. The scroll originally had 84 paintings, of which 5 have been lost. It was done for one Chandrapala of Ahmedabad. Now, we do not know much about the making of this Vasanta Vilasa, but of course, it definitely shows how this genre was actually sowing not only in the western part of North India, but also throughout India at that point of time. Now, the next important manuscript needs to be discussed is the Madhavanta Kamalavanta Katha of 1493, where it was illustrated in Patan. We have to understand that Patan was one of the most important commercial centers, and it was dominated by the Jain merchants. So therefore, the Bhandaras there had a rich collection of these illustrated manuscripts. The story of Madhavanta and Kamakandavala was a popular theme in the 17th century popular Mughal school and also in the Pahari paintings. So the subjects which were illustrated by the Western Indian school remain in the minds of the people for ages, and it continued to remain in the other painting genres of the time. The 15th century illustration trying to keep up the trend of the movement in the figures that was done in Vasanta Vilasa. This extended the scope of secular subject, which hence flourished. We have to understand the concept of movement was new in medieval India, and we also have to understand, since the genre only allowed in the Pothi format, it did not have much space for movement. So wherever little space they had for landscape or the human figures or animal figures, with a little bit of tilt in the head or a gesture of a hand, the movement was then becoming prominent. There was also a new trend of folk orientation. As it can be said, the genre was becoming important, the folk art was also being influenced by this genre, and somehow there was an assimilation of the folk style and the Western Indian painting style. The attempt was to simplify the composition and the colors. The focus of the illustration was always the story, and the composition remained very simple in these format. The attempt was to bring certain movement in the illustration. It deviated from the Jaina rigidity. The monotonous color scheme of the background remained unchanged with the use of red and white again, and the story did not have much scope for landscape illustration, yet it used clouds and rooms decoration to break the monopoly. Now, in the 16th century, the manuscript tradition of this school continued, with the helm now moving on to the Delhi, Gwalior, Agra, which produced excellent manuscripts during this time. The Mahapurana of the Digambaras was now illustrated with grandeur, and these Mahapuranas of 1540, which were painted in Palam, is mention worthy. At least these illustrations prove how movement was now becoming one of the features of the Western Indian painting. This whole trend, by very little gesture, started in the 15th century, but in the 16th century it became prominent. The Mahapuranas of the Digambara sects was simple in its layout. The color format was easier and not very expensive, yet they are much lively compared to its counterparts. Here, interestingly, the further eye was eliminated finally. On the other hand, the color scheme and the representation of the human figures follow the earlier traditions. Mahapurana of the Sakara Bhandara is again very interesting. It is very close to the Chaura Panchashika, which will be discussed in the next module, and belong to the same period. It was illustrated by two groups of painters. Now, we can now understand that there was a time when you have groups of painters being engaged in the layout of one manuscript style. And it is this group of painters who moved from one area to the other, making the genre popular. The short, squat figures of the Mahapurana in the manuscripts are the reminders of, again, the famous Mandu Kalpasutra. Thus, the development of the style in the manuscripts of 15th and 16th century were definitely interrelated, and it is a story of continuity. The constant source of inspiration for these manuscript illustrations was definitely the woodwork of Gujarat and the temple sculptures all over North India. Added to these was the influence of Persian culture with the Muslim rulers of Gujarat imbibed, and it also was an influential culture within North India already. Now let's move to the last quarter of 16th century. The last quarter of the 16th century saw the advent of the artists from the Mughal atelier to Gujarat who failed to seek position there. The traditional painters worked in Gujarat, and to divert them from their acquired skill and conservatism was not an easy task. The patrons were also conservative. In spite of this attitude, Mughal technique was steadily gaining grounds in Gujarat, which also benefited the Western Indian school. The new technique also had to compromise with indigenous elements, and thus the monochrome background and enamel-like colors continued for a long time in Gujarat and Malwa. Later, Mughal landscapes were adopted. The compromise of these two elements gave birth to something called the Rajasthani school, but of course that story will be again dealt in a different module. This term was also used for convenience as an earlier version came from Rajasthan. This form of painting school was found not only in Rajasthan but in parts of Gujarat, Malwa, Uttar Pradesh, Bundelkhand and many other places. While summarizing this module, we have to understand that Western Indian school was a story of continuity, a school which started in the Jaina Bhandaras, became so popular with its iconographic representation that with time it became a genre. And this genre was popular and handy enough to be incorporated into the painting styles of other parts of North India. So much so, this Western Indian school also could depict the Buddhist style of painting, and we do have an Eastern counterpart. Now we have to understand that this was a time when economy was flourishing in North India. It was a time which opened the gates for the Westerners, and the Westerners came with different types of techniques and painting influences. Western Indian painting was receptive enough to incorporate not only the technique but also the taste of this Western painting, especially the Persian school of painting. We have to understand that Persian school of painting was not a conglomeration of one school. It was it had its regional diversities. All these diverse regional schools had effect on the artist's mind. So the artist not only incorporated new colors, as the options of colors were more now, but also the techniques. Now, in doing so, social life was incorporated in the paintings of this genre. Now, this again becomes a very important source of social history information. We have to understand the informations or the sources of social history is very limited, especially about the common man. The involvement of the musicians in common life is depicted in many of these carpet-like borders of Western Indian painting school. The involvement of women musicians and singers and dancers and how they were accepted in this society is also depicted in some of the paintings. Now, therefore, that gives us a different kind of a story about the social life. As far as the importance of the patrons, we have to understand that the Jaina patrons, or maybe the other patrons also, inculcated the culture of illustrating books and keeping them with them, or maybe gifting that to the bhandaras. Books or illustrated books became a part of the treasures of the elite. Now, this was very same in the Persian world too. So, as a result of this kind of cultural exchange, we find that a whole group of artists who specialized in illustrating manuscript painting became popular. Now, it helped in a way for later for the Mughals, because when the Mughals came to India with a very clear vision of establishing their own school, they had a group of trained artists who could incorporate things very easily, who are receptive and were adaptable enough to change their style. So the Mughals had the advantage of these group of artists who were already trained in Western Indian school. The interesting part about Western Indian school, at the end we can say that the school remained intact even today. Because of its closeness to the religious scriptures, the iconographic representations did not change much, and even the basic color compositions remained the same. So therefore, there is always a scope of development true, but also the fact that it somehow remained attached to the history of the time. So Western Indian school is a fine example of a genre which developed in India and which had a story of continuity till date. For more information regarding this school, you can log on to the EPG Pathshala and the text giving along with it. Thank you for your patience listening.